Hello, thank you for the opportunity to present. I am Markus Fromherz. I'm a member of Sandhill Angels. And today I'd like to talk to you as an investor concerned about climate change. Climate change is by far the largest problem facing humanity in the coming decades. I believe startups can play a huge role in addressing climate change, but creating and investing in viable companies is challenging. To help, I'd like to share this introduction into climate action startups from an early investor's perspective. In this presentation, I essentially want to summarize and pass on what I learned over the last year. I'll first remind us why we care about climate change and why this year and this coming decade are so crucial. I'll give an overview of the scope and a brief drill down into one area, negative emissions, with some concrete explanations, terminology, and metrics. I will then walk through 5 categories of enablers and barriers for startups, which is sort of a climate action specific due diligence checklist for investors. I'll end with what you can do and the selection of resources where you can learn more. This talk will be dense. I want to give something concrete to take away and apply. So, climate change. I'm very much hoping that you know and understand the scope of the problem, so this is just a brief reminder with some numbers we'll use later on. The human species depends on a habitable climate, but through the buildup of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere from burning fossil fuels, the Earth's climate is increasingly becoming inhospitable. The problem of a warming planet from greenhouse gases building up is often depicted in this graph, which shows the level of CO2 in the atmosphere over hundreds of thousands of years. Humans have never lived in a world with more than 300 parts per million of CO2 until about 100 years ago. 2 years ago, we were at 407 ppm. As of this year, we have exceeded 410 parts per million, and we may reach 450 ppm by 2050. This increase in atmospheric CO2 is correlated with a rise in the average Earth climate temperature by about 1 degree Celsius from 100 years ago. We may breach 1.5 Celsius by 2040. We are already experiencing more flooding, increased wildfires, larger storms, more droughts, and more disruption. If we reach 2 degrees Celsius, things will get much worse, and anything above that will likely be catastrophic. If we continue with business as usual, humans may not live in an organized society by the end of the century, and perhaps sooner. Given that situation, there's a strong belief based on scientific models that we have about 10 years left to significantly reverse course. 10 years. There are many ways to help, but I believe that it really falls to entrepreneurs to build the commercial solutions that will reverse climate change, and it is investors that provide the fuel for those entrepreneurs. Now, you either are an investor or otherwise imagine you are one, and you are approached by a climate action startup. These are the questions that come up when you're presented with the pitch deck. First, and certainly that was my first reaction, what do those words mean? Then many are the usual questions like, will the technology work? Will it make a difference? Will it be accepted? Also, will regulatory initiatives be in place to support it? Will funding initiatives be available to fuel it? Will it make money? And these are just the questions your experience will give you. You're not even sure. What are the risks? In this presentation, I want to give you at least a sense of how to think about this space and where to find answers. The scope for climate action as it relates to CO2 is sometimes shown in this bathtub picture. We broadly have 3 categories of action. The first is reducing new emissions going into the atmosphere. The second is removing anthropogenic emissions already in the atmosphere, which is often called negative emissions or climate restoration. The third category of climate action is adapting to the impact of climate change when the tub overflows. But why do we need more than emission reduction? Climate action has the goal to limit global warming to under 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. This graph here points to what is now a consensus in the scientific community. Even if all emissions stopped today, we would likely overshoot 2 degrees Celsius of warming due to the greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere. And then there are some emissions that we will likely not be able to get rid of for a long time. The only way the red goal line in this graph can go to zero is by including negative emissions. As a side note, some people are worried that even just considering negative emissions is dangerous, since it may create the belief that we can continue burning fossil fuels and just clean up later. But there is no guarantee that we can. And again, pointing to this model, negative emissions alone will likely never be enough. We have to work on both. Here are the 3 categories in more detail: mitigation, restoration, and adaptation. The first is widely covered and relatively well understood today. The second is barely addressed and will be our focus here. And the third comes into play if you fall short at the first 2. I'm sure you're familiar with emission reduction. It is about reducing the sources for greenhouse gases, bringing emissions to zero, decarbonizing our economy. There are many regulations and incentives already supporting this. More are needed, but it's an area where solutions are increasingly relatively easy to sell and insert in production and use. Restoration, or negative emissions, is about supporting and enhancing greenhouse gas sinks with the goal of removing 1 trillion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere. Why 1 trillion tons? I'll spare you the calculation, but we may have to assume that we will reach 450 parts per million of CO2 by 2050. And if we want to return to 300 ppm, and that difference of 150 ppm is equivalent to about 1 trillion tons of CO2. A typical assumption is that we need another 10 years to develop viable solutions at scale. So if we give ourselves from 2030 to 2050, or 20 years for 1 trillion tons of CO2, we need to remove 50 gigatons of CO2 per year. That's a useful number to remember. It's the scale to be addressed by solutions. We need to remove 50 gigatons of CO2 per year for about 20 years. The problem is that we need to remove carbon from a planet-wide atmosphere that no one seems to feel particular responsibility for. How do we do that? I will now focus on negative emissions for the rest of the talk. The overarching term carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, is used for all methods of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Another term you will often see is carbon capture and sequestration, or utilization, CCS, CCU, CCUS, and variations of that, which is for general technologies that capture carbon and then either sequester, that is stored for the long term, or utilize it in a product. While the term sounds generic, this is traditionally applied to emission reduction only. We have both land-based and ocean-based methods, and then solutions can be divided broadly into those using nature or technology or hybrid of the two. Natural methods tend to be cheaper, around $10 per ton of CO2, while engineered methods tend to be more expensive but faster. And the typical number mentioned as a goal is $100 per ton of CO2. How do these approaches compare? What makes something a good solution? The Foundation for Climate Restoration has proposed 3 criteria for viable methods to impact climate change. They need to be scalable, permanent, and financeable. Concretely, we should prioritize methods that remove at least 25 gigatons of CO2 per year by 2030, which would require 2 such methods at scale to reach the desired 50 gigatons. Of course, more methods at smaller scale would be fine too. So I interpret this as aiming for the 10x when you expect on average the 3x. We also need methods that store CO2 for at least 100 years. Planting trees, for example, is fine, but apart from the land use issue, the stored carbon will be released back into the atmosphere within a few decades when they burn or rot. So that's not viable in the long term. Finally, there are a number of great ideas, but unless we can imagine somebody paying for them, we should probably look elsewhere. I don't really have time in this presentation to explain any carbon dioxide removal method in detail. You will find excellent overviews from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, or in a very readable white paper by the Foundation for Climate Restoration, and in a number of other places. Here, I just want to give you a sense of some popular proposals. I'll mention the first and the last on this list. Direct air carbon capture, or just direct air capture, refers to machines that extract CO2 from the air and store it in, for example, basalt rock, or use it in the production of concrete. This is a method that's still very energy intensive, but the production of concrete with synthetic limestone from such a process is one of the most exciting solutions available. Looking last on this list, enhanced weathering is the process of dispersing crushed silicate or carbonate minerals, so essentially crushed rock, over land or the ocean or on beaches near the ocean, in order to accelerate the absorption and storage of carbon dioxide, which is a natural process. A huge advantage of ocean-based methods worth mentioning is that the ocean area, of course, is much larger and more open than land areas. It is estimated that removing enough CO2 to restore the climate could be accomplished with intentional management of just 1 to 2% of the ocean area. I will now try to present a list of enablers and barriers for climate action startups. These are based on the questions I listed at the beginning and present a sort of climate-specific due diligence checklist. A first key step is to validate the solution. Does the technology actually capture CO2? This can be exceedingly difficult to prove for climate action startups. When faced with an early stage startup, whether or not the technology works has often been scientifically modeled at best, but not demonstrated, or if so, then not at scale and not for long periods. It's also important to validate that the carbon removal is net positive based on a carbon life cycle analysis that considers the entire process. The good news is that many proposals require no major breakthroughs. We have the technologies, but like drug candidates that need to be tested in a diversity of humans before they can be sold, often a series of experiments needs to be conducted to prove out negative emission solutions. Scale and replication represent a related set of issues. Does it scale to a useful size? Does it sequester carbon long enough to buy us time? Does it do so without competing significantly with other needs like food and forest production? Remember, we want to capture 50 gigatons a year and store it for 100 years. The good news is there are a handful of solutions that would scale today. The not so good news is that they are not fully proven and often require substantial investments to scale. These two criteria are why many companies have a hard time going beyond the pilot phase and reaching commercialization. Next on the checklist are environmental concerns. Now, this is a tricky area. In some cases, this has been made impossible for startups to even test an idea because of strong pushback. Of course, we want to minimize and mitigate any side effects that these methods have. But in part, the issue here comes down to philosophical argument. Can we afford not to take action? What are the alternatives? We need to balance the risks of action with the consequences of inaction. We should also take into account that some ecosystems are already damaged, for example, from warming oceans and acidification, and some side effects are actually positive. For example, providing more nutrients for marine life, restoring fisheries, and creating new jobs. That said, I don't want to minimize the concerns. And understanding the effects of a proposed technology on local ecosystems will often be critical to gain support. One of the most difficult aspects of negative emissions startups is the business model. Often there simply isn't one for a commercial entity today. If a solution captures carbon from the air and stores it underground or in the ocean, why would anyone pay for that? A first answer is that there are often byproducts of the proposed process. So we can ask what, if any, commercial products or byproducts can be sold. Not all utilization is helpful. We can sell CO2 for use in sodas, for example, but that will be released back into the atmosphere as soon as the beverage is consumed. Regulatory frameworks will help, but some people would argue that political risk is the largest risk, actually, for large-scale solutions that require friendly policies for mass adoption. There are more ideas being proposed, but carbon dioxide removal requires large-scale infrastructure investments, very often at least, and growth and profits will occur over long-term horizons. In most countries, we are far from an environment that provides the stability needed for such companies. On a more optimistic note, this graph shows a macroeconomic analysis of markets done by the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. The dark blue and dark orange circles are estimated market sizes for this use of carbon in concrete and aggregates for construction, which sequester carbon for the long term. The scale is hundreds of billions of dollars in market size by 2030 on the right, with relatively large CO2 restoration potential. Another recent study by the Thunderbird School of Management at Arizona State University confirmed these markets and estimates a $3 trillion a year overall opportunity by 2030 from climate restoration. So this looks promising. Finally, in our climate action startup due diligence checklist, there are the funding needs. Unfortunately, many climate action startups, because of the previous questions, will be too risky for most investors. We know what questions to ask. I list them here. Often the hardest stage in the seed investment phase is this one. The experimental deployment costs are too large for entrepreneurs to carry, too risky for angel investors, and too early for large investors. So from what I've seen, the options for funding tend to be elsewhere. There are, of course, first, the traditional grants by government agencies. We can help the company apply to incubators. For example, Y Combinator has an effort dedicated to climate action and to carbon dioxide removal technologies in particular. Many companies are spending money on carbon offset. What is relatively new are companies that have promised to spend large amounts on climate action, often with the idea of doing more than just becoming carbon neutral. Microsoft, for example, recently announced that they want to spend $1 billion on climate action. So far, though, unfortunately, it's often unclear how that money will be spent. One notable exception I want to mention is Stripe, which even has a program dedicated to startups. So the good news is a growing number of funding options, but it's still quite difficult to access much of it, and the needed scale isn't quite there yet. I'd like to end with a call to action. You can help head off climate change. If you're an entrepreneur, I believe that the issues outlined in this talk suggest that you need to aim high for a planet-scale solution, but you need to find a way to develop and deploy it incrementally so that it can be tested and financed incrementally. This is, of course, ideally true for all startups, but it's crucial here. And while long-term carbon sequestration should be the goal, interim and early revenue options will make the technology much more palatable to funders. I believe there are many roles for nonprofits, foremost facilitating partnerships between policymakers, entrepreneurs, scientists, and funders. They can be the one voice for an industry telling policymakers what is needed in terms of frameworks, regulations, incentives, and long-term guarantees to allow climate action technologies come to fruition. I'm not addressing the role of governments here, but obviously they have a huge impact on the development of novel technologies by providing and supporting research, developing standards, and leveraging their buying power. Nonprofits could also pool donations and fund scientific research and early experiments to get startups from idea to validation. There are many other important roles for nonprofits, not least among them education. Finally, we, the investors, can have a tremendous impact on climate action startups, even without investing. A first step is prioritizing startups in this space and educating ourselves. We can bring invaluable expertise to startups, mentoring and helping scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs get from models and experiments to a viable business plan. And of course, our risk capital is often what helps move startups to real proof points that allow them to access larger capital and generate revenue. In that respect, we should also consider earmarking some funds for donations to nonprofits, to fund early experiments, to plant the seeds that will later germinate into investment opportunities with the potential for impact at scale. And we can be advisors to nonprofits and contribute to their work as the voice for what the industry needs. So there's much we can do. I hope you will consider getting involved. I leave you with a short selection of resources that you can explore next. Project Drawdown has one of the most principled ways of evaluating climate action ideas. The Foundation for Climate Restoration has a well-researched and written white paper to enter this space. And Air Miners has a list of startups in negative emissions and is also actively building a community. Other resources are the Global CO2 Initiative, Resources for the Future, Climate Advisors, all examples of thought leaders and researchers in climate change action with educational contents and useful toolkits. For investment, you can read interesting content and perhaps access funding at these organizations listed down below. In this talk, I gave you a brief introduction into climate action. I discussed a checklist of questions to consider and how to think about them. And I tried to give concrete pointers for learning and for action. I'd like to thank the colleagues who contributed and gave me feedback to this presentation. They're listed here. I'd also like to put in a plug for the Foundation for Climate Restoration, which is creating a working group of investors interested in climate restoration. If you're interested, send an email to the address here or to me if you want to find out more. Thank you for your attention. Please get involved. We all need you.